Hey guys, it's Rafael, aka Sound Killer, and today I'm gonna deep dive and show you all about pigments. We're gonna do a in-depth tutorial, and I'm gonna explain each and every module, every engine, everything that you can do with pigments. So this is a really in-depth tutorial. It's gonna be basically your handbook or your manual to Pigment 6, to sound design, to synthesis, and you're gonna learn a whole bunch. So this is gonna be a very long video, but it's gonna be very useful. So let's get started. Here, this is Pigment 6. I'm gonna initialize here by selecting a new preset so that we have an empty, completely empty Pigment 6. And I'm gonna start by explaining each and every one of the engines. So starting off here, we have our wavetable engine. And if you guys have already used Vital, Serum, or even Massive, you are already familiar to the concept of wavetables oscillators. But if you're not familiar, basically wavetables are a set of audio that you can use here to manipulate sound. We have a whole bunch of variety here, and I'm gonna select here some natural so you can see why this is super awesome. As you guys can see, there are a whole bunch of styles of sounds. And think of it as a sample that has been imported here, where you can select each individual frame of the sample to modulate, manipulate, and change to make a new unique sound. And here in the wavetable engine, we have quite a few options here. So first of all, here we have our unison mode, and there are 3 modes. So we have our regular unison voice, which can add up to 8 voices. So this is really awesome to create stereo sounds or very wide sounds. We have our chord function so that we can play chords by pressing just one note. And we have our super here, which is basically emulating the JP6000. And it adds, I believe they are 16 voices. I'm not too sure about that one. And this is really awesome for super sauce, which we're gonna talk about later. But let's go back here to the unison and have it to just one voice. I'm gonna lower down the octave now so you can hear what I'm gonna be doing next. And I'm gonna set this morph here disabled, and I'm gonna select here the single wave shape so that you guys can see more clearly what's gonna happen now. So we have a whole variety here of waveform modulators, and these waveform modulators sort of stretch and destroy this initial waveform that you guys can see here. And we have our typical frequency ring modulator, which you guys have probably already seen in all of your favorite synths before. And it basically functions as a FM. This is basically your FM. And you have a few different FM times. So we, for example, have the FM linear, which is a typical FM that you are most common with and you can hear more frequently. We have a exponential FM, which is a lot more aggressive and it creates some really cool sounds. And you can see what's happening here in the FM here with the wavetable as it adds more repetitions of this same wavetable. We also have the ring modulator. Next here we have our phase modulation. This is basically a different style of frequency modulation. And this is more typical in, for example, Serum, where the FM from B is actually phase modulation, not actual frequency modulation. This is going to be very common. For example, Massive had a phase modulation option. And this is something that you might be familiar and can create sounds that you've done in other synthesizers, for example, Massive and Serum. Next, we have our phase transform. And you can think of this basically as some bend types. So for example, bend plus, bend minus. We have different phase transform here. And finally, we have our wave folding, which is basically distortion inside of a wavetable. And it adds more harmonics inside and it adds more elements of the wavetable. And we have different fold shapes. And you can think of it sort of like a FM distorted sound. It sounds really awesome. And then below these, each and every one has a modulator which is controlled by this modulator here. And what this modulator does, it chooses the sound that's going to control these modulators. So for example, right now we have a sine set to 1 as our modulator, and this is on ratios. We can have them to be absolute, which are your common semitones. For example, we can select different wavetables, or we can do something more amazing here, and is that we can use a second engine, which would be engine number 2 here, which is currently turned off, and we can add a second wavetable here and use this wavetable as our modulator that goes inside of here. So basically what we're doing is quite literally FN from B. So if we turn off the output here, and this is the way that you can achieve FM from B, your common FM from B sounds from Serum inside of Pigments here. So going to our second engine here, or our first option here inside of Pigments, is our analog engine, and this is basically emulating a analog synthesizer. So this is gonna have a lot of imperfections, it's gonna phase drift, it's gonna have all of these nice impurities that make a analog synthesizer distinctive. And we're gonna have 3 oscillators inside of this engine, and they all work the same, and they have some really awesome features. So for example, we have our classic saw. We can add all 3 voices so you can hear a more detuned sound. It's gonna sound richer, it's gonna sound fuller. If you want it to sound more vintage and destroyed, you can select here the tune settings and add some more drift here. So for example, 10% drift is gonna make that each voice is farther apart from the tuning. We can lower it so to have a more cleaner sound. And the beautiful part about using the analog is that each note is going to sound different when you play it. It's going to emulate that analog breath and the analog tone. That each note sounds unique and different. And this is going to be complemented by the filters, but we're going to talk more about that later. So as you guys can see, we also have a FM engine here inside of the analog here, and we have our modulator. Again, we can select engine number 2 as our modulator, or we can use oscillator 3 or our noise, which is right here. And we can select which oscillator is going to be affected by the FM. So for example, if I only want FM on oscillator number 2, as you guys can hear, oscillator 1 is not being affected by FM because we didn't select it, but we can enable and disable each one of the oscillators. And the really awesome part about this is that if you use both engines with the analog engine, and we, for example, select them all to be saws, so let's reset these all, disable the FM, we can create the most gigantic super saw that you can imagine. So let's enable here the super, because I really love how the super sounds for a super saw. And if you want the same amount of detune on both of these, you can add a macro, which we're gonna explain later in the video, to the detune here. And you can control here with the macro the detune of both engines. Besides super saws, we also have your classic pull twist. And you can select and adjust the pitch here, as well as the sync, so you can have all the oscillator offset sync with each other. And this is really awesome for those sync lead effects. So continuing to our next engine type, we have our sample engine, and this basically works as a sampler. And what you can do here is that you can load samples. Pigments comes with a whole library of samples, and you can preview them by clicking before selecting. So let's, for example, select this marimba, and we have up to 6 samples that we can select here. So we can create some really cool sounds here. So if you select various, So now we've essentially created those really common multi-key presets that you can find in trap and hip hop. And you can edit the way that it triggers. So for example, if we select here our map, right now it's set to round robin. So that means that every time I press the note, is gonna skip to the next note here. We can set it to random so that it triggers a note randomly. And this sounds really awesome for example, very big chords. And the Temple engine has something else that is very special, and it's this granular engine. So if we go back here to our E piano and enable this granular, you can see that this granular engine is now re-triggering this initial part, because the granular engine is basically taking grains of the sample here and playing that grain over and over again. And we can select, for example, here, set it to go forward. We can adjust the density of the grains, so how much they last. And the higher the number, the faster they're gonna be. And the size is gonna be, well, the size of the grain, how much of the sample it's gonna reference. And you can add a limit on how many samples there's gonna be played. A fair warning, the higher the limit, the higher the CPU usage is gonna be. So if you don't have a powerful PC, try keeping it lower than what you need. And we also get some randomness here for the grains. So for example, we can add some randomness to the density so that it isn't just 18 hertz here, but it's now 18 and 20 over. So it's going to add 20% more variation here in the density. And this is really beautiful for pad sounds especially. Or you can create plucks, you can create synths, you can create leads. I particularly use it for pad sounds because it just sounds beautiful to me to have these be sort of like pad sounds. And it creates some really nice textures for your music. And once again, we have here our modulator, as you guys saw with the wavetable and the analog engine. And this allows us to add sort of a second oscillator. So for example, I can add a saw as a bass layer. And over on the shaper mode here, now we have a few additional modules here. So if I enable, we have our unison, our chord, and our super, but now we have a resonator. And this is basically going to act as what the name says, a resonator. Imagine you have a steel tube and you hit it with something and it creates that nice sharp sound, sort of like a ding. This is what the resonator is emulating. So right now, the trigger of this sound is sort of like if the piano is hitting a steel tube. It's gonna add more harmonics to the sound. After that, we have a bit crusher. It's gonna make it sound lo-fi. It's gonna give it a little bit of character and dirt. And finally, we have some modulation here. So we have our frequency and our ring modulator. And that's where our modulator comes back to play. So if I select this sign here, you can now modulate and add FM to pretty much any sample. So for example, if I add a vocal, we can now create some really funky vocal effects. And it becomes a playground for some really unique sound design overall, because you can pretty much drop any sample. So if you have your own samples that you've recorded, or you want your own vocal or your own voice to be manipulated here, you can just drag and drop here inside of the sampler in Pigments, and you can modulate and you can create some really crazy results here. So our next engine type is the harmonic engine. And right now it sounds as a saw. But this engine functions the opposite way of how you typically sound design. So in a typical synthesizer, you are doing subtractive synthesis, where you have a sound and you start taking away harmonics and tones away from the sound with a filter, for example, which we're going to talk about soon in this video. The harmonic engine works as a additive synthesizer. So if I take away all of the partials here, we have a sine wave. And if I set it here to number 2, now we have a sine wave with one harmonic. if we add 4 harmonics, it sounds more like an organ, and we can go up and add harmonics until it sounds like a saw. And we can select a limit here, so let's set it to 16. And now let's modulate and let's adjust and change each harmonic. So we have here our partial modulation, and what this does is that it selects the partial or the harmonic that we want to modulate. So window size selects the amount of partials that are going to be selected that are going to be affected by this modulation. So right now, if we set it to 16, it's going to select all 16 partials. If we set it lower, it's just going to select the first partial. And if we move the position, it's going to move the position of what partial is being modulated. We can adjust the volume of that partial, and we can FM that partial, because basically a partial or a harmonic is just a sine wave, so we can add some FM to that sine wave to create some really unique tones. We have a cluster here. And it's going to sound like funky FM sounds, because we're basically manipulating sine waves to create unique sounds. After our window, we have our frequency modulation and phase modulation. Again, this is going to be affected by our window size, so what we select here on our window is going to be affected by our phase modulator or frequency modulator. We have here our shape modulator, and this is basically, if we go back here to our super saw, this is going to carve out those harmonics like this, and we have a whole bunch of different styles of carvings. This is going to create some really unique tonal sounds. After that, we have our partial modulation mode, and this is basically just shifting each individual partial to the left or the right of the sample. So for example, we select a split here, we can have all even harmonics go to their right and all odd harmonics go to the left to create some really unique stereo sounds. And finally, we have, again, once more, our modulator, which controls the modulation type here. And finally, on our engines, we have our model engine. And this is basically a physical modeling engine. And this is one of the newest additions here inside of Pigment 6. And it's really awesome. Again, it sounds like a saw at first, but this is basically sort of emulating what a actual instrument does. So for example, we have here selected our resonator type as string, but if we select it to beam, it's gonna sound like a tube. And it's gonna mimic that vibration that it makes when you hit a tube. And the hitting tone is gonna be controlled here by our exciter mode. So right now the collision is a synthetic trigger, and you can have it have a long attack, and you can sort of adjust the tone of the exciter here. You can have a transient, which would basically be a click, and you have a variety of clicks that you can select to trigger the sound, and depending on the click, it's gonna change the sound quite a bit. And this one sounds very bell-ish. If we go back to our string, I really like the organic tone here for the string, and I'm gonna sort of try to make a guitar tone. So here on our resonator, we have quite a few options. So for example, we have our stereo here, which adds detune to the sound. We have our bass, which controls the lower harmonics. If we have it set to 0, there's gonna be no bass or no low harmonics. Our decay basically controls how fast the sound is gonna mute. So right now at 0 decay, we can fully hear just the transient sound. But as we add decay, we can sort of hear what the sound actually sounds like. The brilliance is basically the brightness of the sound. And it's starting to sound a lot like of a guitar now. The warp is really interesting because it sort of shifts and shapes the harmonics of the sound. And basically shifting the harmonics up or down depending on where you're shifting it to. And right now it sounds nice, it sounds harmonic because we have our quantization enabled, but if we disable the quantization, they can create some really cool atonal sounds for some really scary soundscapes. Again, we have some more control over our sound here with the timbre. We can select a few different options of tones. And we have also our shaper, which is not going to do anything until you add some morph here. And this is basically just going to carve out certain harmonics and frequencies out of the sound. And finally, we have our exciter mode here. This is basically sort of like a granular or a retrigger of the exciter. So this basically keeps the exciter retriggering to create some really awesome soundscapes. And you can create some really cool textures with this, or you can create some really cool pad sounds. Especially if you use the slow attack of the collision. Here we have a additional engine, and this is the utility engine, and think of it as a third oscillator to complement engine number 1 and engine number 2. You have a few noises here that you can add, so you can have 2 noises, and you can have an oscillator. And you get quite a few controls here with the oscillator. So for example, you can control the pitch of the oscillator, the fine tuning. If we select a square wave, we can select the pulse width. You can have it not be in pitch. So right now it's not tracking the key input. And if you're gonna modulate the chorus here or the pitch, you can select and quantize what notes you want it to have modulated. On the right here, we have our filters. And we have 2 filters because you can select on each of the engines if you want to go to filter number 1 or filter number 2. We have different types of filter routing. So for example, we can have filter number 1 go into filter number 2, or we can have filter number 1 and filter number 2 be split and go individually into the FX module. We can have them do a formal split by going to FX number A and FX number B, and I'm going to talk and show you guys more about that in a minute. Right now, if there are split, but in some, it means that filter number 1 and filter number 2 are gonna go into FXA. And right now we have a huge variety of filters, as you guys can see. So we have these classic filters, which are analog emulating filters. So for example, if we select here the low pass, you can see we have a analog to digital converter, and this is gonna adjust the tone here of the resonance and the drive. It's gonna switch the tone a little bit, as you guys can see here. The analog is gonna sound warmer, it's gonna sound thicker, it's gonna sound fuller, where the digital is gonna sound sharper and more precise. We have our cluster filters, which are a combination of peaks of different filter types. We have a phaser, which is basically just the peaks of a phaser filter added here into as a filter. We have some formant filters, which is gonna give you a cool vocal tone. It's gonna sound sort of like a throat. Sort of sounds like a person talking, like it gives it that like that very deep throat tone and throat sound. After that, we have our surgeon filters, which are gonna be some very sharp and very aggressive filters. Very surgical, you can't control the peak of these, as these are meant to just cut sounds. We have some lo-fi filters here, which are very cool for unique sounds, because it's gonna give it... It's gonna sound sort of like a bit crusher, but it's a unique style of bit crushing that is happening here with the lo-fi filter. It's really cool for experimentation and for getting some very weird sounds. We have our classic comb filters. It's gonna create some really cool harmonic sounds. And then we have our analog filters, and these are filters that are modeled from actual analog hardware. So for example, we have a mini filter here, which is from a Moog style filter. We have an MS-20 filter. We have the matrix filter. And these are all modeled to sound as accurate as the original analog synthesizer they're modeled from. So for example, we have the Jupiter 8 filter here, which has a low pass, 12 dB low pass, and 24 dB low pass. We have an SEM filter here. We have some VCA style filtering here. And we can add some FM sources here into the filter to create some really wild and really unique sounds here with the filter. And this can be done with a lot of other filters. So for example, if we select again our classic filter, you can have different sources controlling the filter here. So for example, LFO1 is going to control now this filter, and that's basically just controlling the cutoff. There are certain filters that are controlled by the engines. So if we enable here a analog engine here with a sine wave, you can really play around it. You can really do a lot with cross modulation here from one area to another. And there's a whole bunch of more modulations that you can do. So if we disable here the filter, we have our classic envelopes here, which can control the sound here by adding attack, decay, sustain. We have our classic LFO sounds here that we can also add. So for example, if I add some pulse width modulation with some LFO here, we get some really classic Juno sounding pads here. We have some functions here. So if we go here to the functions, you can create some custom LFO curves here. This is really cool for sequencing, to create some really cool sequences here. So for example, if I go here and I add this here, we have here a random engine, which basically does what the name implies. It adds random values to the knob that you're controlling. So for example, if we add here a random to the coarse pitch, and we can select random number 1, which is this square cool random thing, you can select the type of modulator that you can have here. There's different types of random modulators. So for example, if you have the true random is gonna be always triggering if we use the sample and hold. The sample and hold isn't gonna be triggered unless we press or we trigger a sound, but we can select what is going to trigger. So for example, we can have the sequencer clock here. We can have the legato keyboard. We have here our Turing random. And then here we have our combinate, which is going to combine and it's going to fuse different types of modulations here. So we can, for example, add a sum here, a difference. We can have this be envelope number 2 to LFO number 1. This is going to do some math. You can select the amount, as you guys can see. So envelope number 2 is going to increase the amount of LFO that's going to be triggered. It's going to do some cool math things, and then you can use this to control the sound like that. And you can create some really unique modulations here with the combinate modulators. So now that we talked about the modulators, let's go here into the effects. And we have a whole suite of effects here. So I'm going to select here a saw that you guys can hear the effects. And we have our effects neatly organized by the type of effect they are. So we have spatial effects, which add dimension to the sound. We have dynamic effects, which is going to control the sound. We have the filters, which we already saw. We have distortions and modulations. And so, for example, if we add some spatial effects like delay, we get a delay effect. We have different types of delay. We have different types of reverbs. We can add a compressor here. We have the classic OTT here inside of Pigments. And a lot of these spatial effects and these effects in general, they have presets here that you can select. So, for example, the OPP, because O Pigments. We have some more filters here that you can select. We have EQ to shape and carve your sound even more precise. We have a vocoder, which I won't go into too much detail in this video because it's a very complex effect, but it basically does what a vocoder does. You have a input source that controls the vocoder, which right now engine number 2 isn't enabled, so it's not going to do anything. You have different vocoding types. We have some distortion, we have a bit crusher, and we have more modulations. This basically just copy and paste the sound with some subtle detuning. The chorus basically does the same thing but with 2 voices, but we can add 3 voices. It slightly delays one of the voices, so it copies and pastes the sound and sort of delays it. It creates a nice stereo effect. We have a classic Juno 6 chorus, which is a emulation of the Juno 106 chorus. We have a flanger. We have a analog flanger, which is emulating the BL20 flanger module. This is gonna sound very 80s, very vintage. We have a phaser. And we can select if we want it to be synced to the BPM. And finally, we have a panner, which is gonna move your audio left and right in a very fast or very slow manner to create a sort of fake but very wide sound. It's gonna create what those 3D audio sort of emulate, where you feel that the audio is going left and right. It's gonna create that really cool 3D effect. And we're not done with Pigments. Pigments is such a complete synthesizer and has so much. And our final module here is our sequencer. You can basically create sequences here inside of Pigments that are gonna play while you hold the note. And this is gonna be really awesome, like just to create sequences like ARP sequences and stuff like that, for example for trance tracks. And you can create random sequences here. You have different presets already made, and you can have an arpeggiator here. And this is really awesome, for example for live playing, for creating unique ARPs, unique sequences, unique patterns. The power of the sequencer alone is more powerful than even some DAWs. And it's really awesome to deep dive into Pigments, because for $200 you get a complete synthesizer that can create pretty much any style of sound that you can imagine and think of inside of Pigments, because you have a huge variety of engines, you have a huge variety of effects, a huge variety of filters, and a huge variety of modulators, and you can create pretty much anything. The sky is the limit with Pigments. And I'm very strong and very sure and very certain that Pigments is the ultimate synthesizer right now, because it's such a complete package that gets updated frequency and gets even more features added frequently, that it makes it a worth investment. I've owned Pigments 6, Pigments 3, where we only had basically 3 engines, and it was one of the most amazing synthesizers that I had, and they just keep adding more features that it's completely crazy how much you can do here with Pigments here. So hopefully I explained pretty much everything in the synthesizer. I do post Pigment tutorials often on the channel, so if you want to see some sound design tutorials, subscribe to the channel. But this was a crash course Pigments. I'm super excited about sharing this with you guys. Hopefully you guys will learn something on how to do sounds in Pigments. And I hope that if you don't have Pigment, that this video inspired you to get Pigments. Anyways, I was Rafael. Thank you Arturia for sending out Pigments. I'm really excited about this synthesizer because it's truly amazing. And thank you guys so much for watching this video. This was Soundkiller, and I'll see you in the next one.